Hello there. Today I'm taking a look at a wine that we've been sent by Ben and Helen McLauchlan, and they claim that this is the first Prosecco to be produced in New Zealand's Marlborough region, so in a region in the northeast corner of New Zealand's South Island. This wine is a single vineyard wine, and it gains its sparkle through a second fermentation in the bottle, so using the same techniques, the method traditionnel, as you'd find in champagne. So all of these factors, the fact it's from New Zealand, the fact it's a single vineyard wine, the fact it's made by the traditional method, are non-typical for Prosecco. Not unheard of, but non-typical. Now, Prosecco is a protected geographical name, referring to a region in northeastern Italy and the sparkling wines that are produced there. However, it's not always been quite that clear, and thus in 2013 there was a ruling by the World Trade Organization, the WTO, that the term Prosecco could continue to be used by winemakers in Australia and by extension in New Zealand, because previously the grape variety had been known as Prosecco. The standardisation to use the varietal name Glera had come subsequent to vineyards being planted in Australia, in Victoria, in places like the King Valley, under the name Prosecco. And thus, because they'd had a tradition of already using this term Prosecco as a grape variety name, something that can't be trademarked, Australia and New Zealand were allowed to continue using this term for sparkling wines made from this grape variety. Now, Prosecco is popular on the New Zealand market. Both Proseccos imported from Italy and Australia doing well. To be fair, this is pretty much Australia's only export market for its Proseccos. And the wines offer a good value alternative to the bottle fermented Pinot Noir and Chardonnay blends that are produced in New Zealand. The wines tend to have a little sweetness, they tend to have a softer bubble, thus they offer consumers a different style as well as good value for money. Now, in 2023, New Zealand concluded a free trade agreement with the European Union, and one of the stipulations of that free trade agreement would be the ceasing by winemakers of using the term Prosecco to describe their wines. This free trade agreement came into effect as of the 1st of May this year, 2024, and the producers have 5 years to cease using the term Prosecco. So this is a term that's going to be phased out in the foreseeable future. I did check on the idea that this was the first Marlborough Prosecco, because I thought I'd seen other wines. Firstly, I noticed that actually there is Glera being produced and being labelled as Prosecco in the Gisborne region. That's in New Zealand's North Island. However, I did also find a wine from a producer in Marlborough that was labelled as Prosecco, and thus I had to do a little bit more research, and it turns out that the producer Toi Toi used to make a wine that was labelled as being in a Prosecco style. So actually the wine was made from Müller-Thurgau, Riesling and Pinot Gris, so there was no Glera planted there at all, and thus that wine is no longer produced. So I think it is fair to say that this is Marlborough's first example of a Prosecco. Now, Balvonie is a farm that has been in Ben McLauchlan's family for, I believe, 5 generations now. It was first purchased in 1859. Ben and his wife Helen returned to New Zealand back in 2013, bought a property near to where his uncle was farming, the Balvonie Farm. They started planting grapevines in 2014 and eventually bought out his uncle's ownership of the farm in 2017. So as a result, they now have somewhere in the region of 120 hectares of mature vines, and they also have a business grazing cattle for the production of Wagyu beef. As I say, they began planting vines in 2014. Their block of Glera wasn't planted until 2021, so the 2023 vintage is the first vintage that they've produced off that. The other varieties they have planted are Pinot Noir, Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc, but those varieties are sold to other companies to make the wine. The Rapaura District, where the farm is in the Wairau Valley. In fact, the name Balvonie comes from a Scottish word which is translated as being at the foot of a hill or in the lee of a hill. The soils in the Rapaura district tend to be well drained. They do say that as former sheep pasture, this is well fertilised land as well. They have some subsurface irrigation, subsurface to try and make sure that the vine's roots stay as deep as possible in the soil, and they're not brought to the surface by the availability of irrigation water. Typically, Glera is a grape variety producing quite large volumes of fruit. The vines are trained to 2 canes to try and harness that vigour, and the vineyards here are all sustainably farmed. One of the results of the vine's vigour is the fact that they have to spend a lot of time trimming the vines and tucking the vines in. So the wine is made entirely from the Glera grape variety, so the grape variety that's used in production of Prosecco in Italy. It was all picked on the 29th of March. The fruit was chilled overnight and gently pressed as whole bunches the next day. So that should be giving nice clean juice. And what they say is that only the free run juice was collected and used for making this wine. So at a stage when the pressing became too extractive, they would run the remaining juice off into another vessel for other uses. So this is just the earliest pressing juice. Again, giving you a fine juice with good acidity, delicate flavours. Now, fermentation took place in temperature controlled stainless steel tanks, and they were using a yeast that's referred to as nutcracker yeast. Now, I have no idea stylistically what nutcracker yeast does for it, but that's specifically mentioned in the notes. The wine is still a still wine at this stage. It's chill stabilised and then goes into bottle with an amount of sugar and yeast for its second fermentation. And one of the compromises that's been made here is between quality and style. Traditionally, if you're making a bottle fermented sparkling wine, the wine will spend at least a year in bottle aging, allowing the yeast to break down, fix the bubbles, and provide richness to the wine. But in this case, because of the delicate fruit in the Glera grape variety, they've cut down the period of yeast aging to just 2 months. So that's not going to give any sort of doughy, bready, yeasty notes to the wine. It'll probably give it a little bit more richness, but more importantly, it allows the wine to retain all its freshness. Now, the wine is labelled as extra dry. I'd assume that's probably been achieved by the adding of a dosage, so a certain amount of sugar to sweeten up the wine. Extra dry as a category tends to be for wines that have slightly more sugar in them than a wine that's labelled as brut. Also notable in the analysis of this, they said the pH is just 3.09 and the acidity is 8 grams per litre. So I'm expecting a wine with plentiful freshness. So let's have a look at it and see how we're going. Now, I've been talking for quite a while, but there are still bubbles rising here. So there is some persistency to the bead. As I swirl the wine, you're getting a fairly vigorous and quite large bubble being released. It's not the fine bubble that you would see with the champagne. And I think that's reflecting the fact that it's not had long yeast aging, which would traditionally be the way of fixing a fine bead in a sparkling wine. So looking at the colour, this is a really pale greenish yellow with very little intensity whatsoever. I probably don't need to swirl it because the aromas are being given off by the bubbles escaping anyway. Now, there's a medium intensity of green fruits here. The aromas are of apples and pears. I'm getting an impression sort of tin pears, so perhaps with that sort of slight syrupy note to them. There are perhaps just the slightest grassy hints, but the notes are all on a green spectrum. So let's have a taste. When you take the wine into your mouth for the first sip, you end up with a rush of large bubbles that foam and dissipate quite quickly. It gives an almost sort of sherbety note to the wine. There are touches of apple and pear, but they're quite delicate and they're to the back of the wine. There are also slight estery notes, hints of banana and touches of those old-fashioned pear drop sweets, that sort of thing. And that's more to the front of the mouth. There is a reasonable freshness and I can feel myself salivating, but there's something to do with the fizz that's actually covering that up, and I don't feel that the wine quite has the sharpness or the crispness that I'd expect from a wine with 3.09 pH and 8 grams per litre of acidity. So let's have another taste. The wine is really cleanly made. There's a slight sort of bitter grip, almost like a pear skin, across the mid palate. And again, perhaps actually that's the richness of the fruit hiding the acidity a little bit. The wine is perhaps medium bodied. It's only 11.8% alcohol according to its label. So maybe that's that little bit of a richness that the yeast has given it in the 2 months that it's aged in the bottle. The wine's quite straightforward fruit, doesn't change much. You've got those apple and pear notes on the mid palate, but then as you get to the finish, there's more of that bitterness. There's a little bit of lemony acidity and some mineral notes on the finish. And the finish actually lasts fairly well. When I first tasted this wine, the fruit wasn't quite as open as this, and I was less impressed. Now that this has warmed a little, there's actually a little bit more depth and complexity to the fruit. This is a wine I've been interested to try. It's something different. I don't often drink Prosecco. I tend to favour champagnes and Pinot Noir Chardonnay bottle fermented wines. Wines that are a little drier and perhaps have a finer bead as well. That having been said, this is a wine that's being sold in New Zealand for 35 New Zealand dollars. Now, according to the label, they've only made 1,700 bottles, so it's not widely distributed, and I very much doubt that we'll see this in export markets at all. However, that's quite a high price point when you consider that in the same market you probably buy Prosecco quite easily for somewhere in the region of $20. Is this a superior Prosecco? I think maybe its cleanliness and its intensity might suggest that. It's clearly well made. I'm not entirely sure about its acidity. There is certainly freshness there, but perhaps the wine's sugar level at 12.5 grams per litre gives the wine more sweetness than I would generally look for in a sparkling wine of this sort. So yes, I'd like to say thank you to Ben and Helen for sending us the wine. I think it's an interesting first release. Like I say, I'm not sure about the pricing, but I think there's certainly a level of quality in the wine that's made it worth a try. So thank you so much for joining us. I do hope you've enjoyed the tasting. If you have, do please press the like button. If you have any comments, please pop those in the comments box below. If you have any friends you think might like to watch the video, do please feel free to pass it on to them. That would be fantastic to get your endorsement in that way. So once again, thank you for joining us, and I do hope you'll make some time and come and join us for another video tasting in the very near future, won't you? Till then, bye for now.